for Australian and Chinese arts and culture at Western Sydney University. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that today's event is being held on the Darug people's land, and their ancestors have been the traditional owners of their lands for thousands of years, and we pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My name is Jing Han. I'm the director of this institute. I would like to acknowledge the presence of Western Sydney University Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Claire Pollack. So honoured that you are here. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of the founding director of this institute, Professor Jocelyn Che, and also the president of Asian Arts Society, Jackie Menzies, and of course Kevin Hopgood Brown, AM, whom I will introduce shortly. When I first came to Australia from Beijing in early 1988, I was so shocked by what I found actual Australia was, far from what I had imagined and assumed based on my exclusive reading of 19th century English novels and a film that we watched millions of times called The Jin Air. To me, Mr. Rochester became the romantic symbol, and one wonders why I didn't find my Mr. Rochester in Australia. I was also shocked, equally shocked, by how little Australians in general knew about China, assuming that Chinese people lived in misery and in ignorance under the Communist Party. Countries are made up of people, and countries are like people. Once you get to know each other, the distance becomes shorter. The aim of my China Story Conversation series is to bring the understanding of the multifaceted China through sharing lived experiences and knowledge in China by Australians from a wide range of professions. For this second episode, we are truly thrilled to have the highly celebrated and award-winning TV and reading presenter and journalist Tracy Holmes. I will introduce Tracy shortly. Today, we are greatly honoured and privileged to have Kevin Hopgood Brown, AM, to open this session. Kevin is a long-standing China expert, having lived and worked in China for many years. He is the managing director of HHK, a corporate advisory firm focusing on investment and infrastructure projects involving Australia and China. Kevin was an international law firm partner where he had postings in Beijing, San Francisco, Taipei, and Sydney. He also taught at the law school of Peking University from 1983 to 1987. Kevin served as the deputy chair of the Australian government's Australian-China Council. He was the national president of the Australian-China Business Council from 2005 to 2008. He has recently chaired the Foundation for Australian Studies in China, FASIC, supporting 37 Australian studies centres in universities and institutes throughout China. Kevin is the chair of the advisory board of China Studies Centre at Sydney University, and Kevin has been serving on the advisory board of this institute. Please welcome Kevin Hopgood Brown, AM, to give the opening speech.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that very generous welcome. It's great to see everyone. Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor Pollack, good to see you. Tracy, we're looking forward to your talk tonight. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and to honor their elders, past, present, and future. I'm always a bit nervous when I'm introduced as an expert in anything. I feel, Jane, like you've given me a promotion. Thank you very much for that. But I don't feel like I'm an expert in anything, and certainly not in China. Because when I first moved to China in 1983, I had no China background. I was quite envious of some of my fellow foreigners who were in Beijing at that time, who'd been steeped in Chinese language, culture, and history for a very long time. I was living out at the Friendship Hotel, so I was surrounded by quite an array of diverse foreigners, some who were there in 1949 and never left, and others who had arrived more recently from overseas and other parts of China. And every day was new to me. It was exciting, it was stimulating. I felt like I was learning something every day. And as I got to know some of my other foreign friends and colleagues, I always loved hearing their stories about their lives and experiences around China. However, I was often puzzled because some of those experiences were quite at odds with my own experience. And sometimes I found myself asking myself, are we talking about the same country? It was that diverse. These experiences made me recall the 2,500-year-old Indian Vedic story that many of you have heard about the 6 blind men who encountered an elephant. And each man set about describing the elephant based on the part of the elephant that was closest to each guy. So one guy felt the elephant's trunk and described the elephant to his colleagues as being long and strong like a snake. Another guy was feeling the elephant's ear and pronounced that the elephant was like a bird in that it had large flapping wings. The third guy was feeling the elephant's leg, and he described the elephant as being stout and solid like an enormous tree. I won't go through all 6, you get the idea. There have been countless commentaries on this parable over the years about the meaning of the story. But for me, in the context of China, it had a very profound impact. I realized very early in my time in China that China was too big, too diverse, changing too rapidly to fit into any single commentary, and way beyond my own capacity to really absorb what was going on. And frankly, an impossibility, because Xinjiang is so different from Shandong, and Shandong is so different from Guangdong. I realized that every story that I heard about China revealed something different about the storyteller and about China. And since I had that realization fairly early on, I've loved hearing the stories of different people's experiences in China, particularly when those experiences are different from my own. I learn something every time I hear someone's China story. Tonight we're very fortunate to hear the China story of Tracy Holmes. For over 30 years, Tracy's been helping shape our understanding of the world through her journalism, her analysis, and her commentary. She's lived and worked in Hong Kong and in China, and she's experienced firsthand the joys and the challenges of journalism in this very dynamic part of the world. Her full professional biography is in the materials that you received with the information about this program, so I hope you read her full biography. It is very impressive indeed. So my friends, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Tracy Holmes.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for such an interesting speech full of stories. And we will actually hear Kevin's My China story in this series soon. Let me introduce a bit about Tracy, and thank you so much, Kevin, for the introduction of Tracy. Years before I met Tracy in person, which happened only recently, I remember watching Tracy on the international channel of China Central TV when I was having a holiday there around 2005. And her vibrant presentation, clear articulation, and a bright-colored fashion style left a deep impression on me. I've been since following Tracy reporting on TV and radio. I'm not a sports fan, but I have always enjoyed Tracy's reporting because Tracy goes beyond traditional sports reporting, focused on stats, scores, winners or losers, but it always has this thoughtful touch on humanities. Her current radio podcast program called The Ticket is a fascinating program, covering intriguing and very complex issues such as transgender equality, e-game gambling, politics around human rights and boycotts, etc. Her global experiences are clearly shown in her global perspectives and deep understanding of human issues, complex human issues, such as sport, as Tracy says. And also, very interestingly, many people do not know, and Tracy didn't know this until a couple of years ago, Tracy's great-great-grandfather was a Chinese who came to Australia from Fujian province in the 1850s. Tracy is a well-known TV and radio presenter and journalist with over 30 years of experience working on national and international networks, including ABC, Australia, China Central TV, later on China Global Television Network, Beijing, CNN International at Abu Dhabi, and also worked in Seoul and as well as Dubai and Hong Kong. She was the first Australian female to host a national sports program, ABC Grandstand, which I often listened. And she has covered 14 Olympic Games, including the Beijing Winter Olympics in February this year, where she received the International Olympic Committee's 2021 Women in Sports Award for the Oceania, being the first journalist to win this prestigious award in recognition of outstanding journalism, leadership, and mentorship for the next generation of women sports journalists. Tracy has also taught at UTS, the Australian Film, TV and Radio School, as well as ROC Young Reporters program. Then I will invite Tracy for a presentation first, and then followed by our conversation, and then we'll get questions from the floor. So now please welcome Tracy Holmes to give her presentation.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Kevin, for your introduction, and hello everybody, special guests, the Dara people, the traditional owners of this land, and everybody who is joining us online also. I just want to confirm pretty much everything that Kevin said about China. You can't define it, and somebody once told me very early on in my experience in China, look, you know, the only thing you need to know really is this old Chinese saying, I'm not sure if it is or isn't, but they said to me, if it doesn't move, it's dead. And China is constantly moving. And I thought that's very true, and I often repeat that to people that I'm talking to back here in Australia, because we have such a desire to know what is our goal, where are we heading, what is our end position. But in fact, in this world, there is no end position. The stories just keep on coming. So please excuse me also because I've got a tickle in my throat. I'm not contagious, I have nothing. I had a real ear infection, so I'm just dealing with that. Okay, so my China story. It's quite an interesting one because it didn't actually begin in China. I was born to two parents who were quite young, my mother and her father, who were young surfers. My mum was 18, my dad was 22. My dad used to shape surfboards. Both of them used to surf, and this was at a time when surfing was a lifestyle, and a pretty poor lifestyle. We didn't make a lot of money from it, so they were trying to find ways where they could make money from it. So it was just the beginning of the professionalism of that sport. Now, my father, if he wasn't shaping surfboards, he was always listening to the grapevine to hear where the best surf was. So my dad was notorious for going to work in the morning and we might not see him for 6 weeks. Because in the middle of his workday, he would hear that the surf 800 kilometres away was really good. So he hopped in his combi van and went there. And he would return when the surf finished. Now, one of the ideas he heard was that South Africa had some really good surf. So when I was 2.5, he said to my mum, we're hopping on this boat and we're going to go for 14 days or 17 days to South Africa and we're going to check out the surf there. When we arrived, obviously, South Africa was a very different place to the northern beaches of Sydney. It was in the middle of the apartheid regime, so it wasn't particularly good for many of the majority of the population, the black population. But my mum and dad would travel frequently. We would drive through African townships, we would stop, we would talk, we would learn many things. My mum would take all sorts of ideas about clothing, and she was a seamstress as well, so she would make stuff that she learned from them. And we just had this incredible mix of cultures and other people that we met that had also come from other places like Peru or Brazil or many other countries that had come to South Africa to surf. My mother started a surfing contest, which is still running. It's the longest running professional surfing event in the world. And invited to that contest were two surfers who came with a great reputation from Hawaii. So they were Hawaiian-blooded professional surfers at that point. When they arrived in South Africa, obviously, their skin was black, but they were coming in to compete in this semi-professional event. So they were given honorary white visas in their passports. When they arrived at the contest site, they realised this honorary white visa meant nothing because everybody looking at them would see a black person. So they felt uncomfortable going to any white venues because they'd be stopped at the door. They didn't feel comfortable going to Zulu venues because they didn't look like Zulus. So they would compete through the day, go back to their hotel room and just sit there all night. My mother got wind of this and said, it's no good. You need to come and stay in our house. So both of them moved into our place. They stayed there for the duration of their journey. We shared many wonderful stories. I was quite young at the time, but I remember hearing them speak frequently of their life and telling stories of their travels. When they got back to Hawaii, their mother and father wrote to my mother and father and said, you saved our boys' lives. They would not have dealt with their experiences in South Africa had it not been for you. You must let us repay this hospitality, so please come to Hawaii. So my dad saw that as an invitation to pack up family, go to Hawaii and start our next adventure. So when we got there, we were living with them. Now, they had been caretakers of an old Chinese cemetery for many decades. So the house we were living in was down the bottom of a very steep driveway, and here was an old Chinese cemetery with a whole lot of tombstones. Some had fallen down, others were still upright, with this fascinating writing that I hadn't seen before in the Chinese characters. And one of the things I learned very early on was this Hawaiian grandfather who ran the household that we were living in said, okay, listen you kids, I'm happy to have kids here, but I tell you what, the first sign of trouble, all the local kids will tell you what happens. I take you up to the bone house on the top left-hand corner of the Chinese cemetery, and I'll lock you in there for the night. And there's ghosts and it's frightening, and so of course being two young kids, my sister and I were and misbehave. Not that the bone house ever freaked me out, but it was the start of some real intrigue on my part. Like, how did all these Chinese people end up here in Hawaii, and what is their story? Anyway, this kind of continued, and I'll jump forward a little bit now, because 50 years later, I find myself travelling through some of the old grave sites in regional and rural New South Wales, looking for the tombstone of my great-great-grandfather, who I now know was Chinese and came here during the 1840s or 50s. How I found out about that story, I think we're going to discuss with Jean a little bit later. But in 2001, my husband moved to Hong Kong to work for CNN International. So, of course, the three kids and I packed up and went with him. As he started work, I started exploring, which is what I like to do when I first arrive in a place, just go down as many back streets as I can find. The first place I found in Hong Kong was going through the national park to a little tiny hamlet, if you like, at the bottom of this track called Shek O. And it was a little fishing village that was just remarkable. I completely fell in love with this place. And it was a really nice mixture of many locals, some of whom never wore shoes because there was no need, you just go down to the beach every day. It kind of positioned it on this side of the headland, and on the other side was a surfing beach. So it was perfect for us. So I said to my husband after a few weeks, listen, I keep going down to this village when you go to work, and I really love it there. I feel really comfortable. I think it'll be a great place for the kids because they can interact with a lot of local kids. It's very homely. He said, okay, fine, well, you speak to a real estate, you find out, what's available to rent, and we'll move there. So I thought, fantastic. So the next weekend he said, okay, so we're heading to Shek O to look at some places. And I said, yeah, here we are. So we get to Shek O. We had to catch a taxi with the kids and finally we pull up to this little village. There's a roundabout, effectively. You drive in, you go to the roundabout, you drive back out, that's it. So we hopped out of the taxi and he said, so is there a real estate agent meeting us here? I said, no, there's no real estate agents for Shek O. He said, okay, so are there houses to rent? I said, well, I think so. And he said, what do you mean you think so? I haven't got time for this. I'm, what's your plan? And I've got the youngest child, in front because he's still a baby, about 12 weeks old. The other two are here, and they just wanted to go and play at the beach. And I said, well, my plan is this. I thought if we just stand on this roundabout, because it's the only place to go in and out of this village, someone will see us and someone will come to us and we'll find a house to rent. I won't use every word he used in saying to me, you really are an airhead, aren't you? Anyway, as we were having this discussion about me being an airhead, this Chinese guy comes walking along and he says, Stan! And Stan says, Bill! Bill says, what are you doing here? Stan says, well, my wife's got this pea-brained idea that if we just stand in the middle of this roundabout, someone will rent us a house. And he said, you know what, my cousin owns nearly every house in Shek O. I know the 6 that are available. Let's go and have a look. I've never let my husband get that story down. I'm no airhead. Anyway, village life there was fantastic. And then we stayed there till the end of 2004, and CNN asked Stan to move to Beijing to be the senior correspondent in Beijing at the bureau there. So, we left the very mild subtropical climate of Hong Kong and the beach lifestyle that our kids had, and went to this much harsher, very beautiful Beijing winter. We left on Christmas Eve. We hopped on a train which took 28 hours, but it took us through all the different landscapes. And so we knew that when we arrived in Beijing, it would be Christmas Day. Not that Christmas Day was really celebrated in Beijing, but it was a great journey for the kids to be able to see the changing landscape that we were moving through to this new home. When we arrived there, again, I went on a tour of discovery, and Ho-Hai is kind of it's quite touristy, but it's very beautiful, and a lot of locals live in the area around it. And when this beautiful big lake freezes over in winter, you can ice skate. And they've also got these incredible, they're just ingenious, it's like a chair like that put on slides. So the kids can go and sit on the chair, and it's like a sled, and they push through these 2 sticks. It's just fabulous. So our 3 boys hopped on those, Stan and I were standing around, and suddenly these 2 men in very dark clothes, dark pants, dark jackets, but very tall and very strong, skated in front of us, did a big slide, went off to our kids, took their sled, took off at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and then threw our children. And our 3 kids were sliding off in all different directions. Stanley chasing after them. These 2 guys just disappeared very quickly into the crowd. But we knew then that was our warning. You know, we're watching you. And so we always lived in Beijing, never afraid, but always conscious of the fact that we were the other, and they were watching what we were doing. And so we had this incredible, I feel so privileged because I was lucky to go and work at China Central Television while Stan was working for CNN International. We had this very sort of awkward situation when I'd be at work at CCTV with all my Chinese colleagues, whom I was learning so much about this place and this huge city, which is so incredibly beautiful. It can be so incredibly delicate but incredibly hard at the same time. It's just all of these different conflicting emotions and feelings. And we'd be chatting, and we would always have CNN on the big TV at the end of the table. But whenever CNN crossed to my husband with a story on China, the TV would go black. And my colleagues would feel really embarrassed because they knew that was my husband's story that they would never see. So everyone suddenly got very busy on their computers, when my husband's story disappeared. And then suddenly when his story finished, CNN would pop back up again and we would just go on chatting. But it was an incredible experience for both of us because it was really nice for me to be able to come home at night and give my husband a different version of the story that he'd been telling for an international market about China. And this comes back to something you were saying, Kevin, there is no one story of China. There's 1.5 billion stories of China. And one of the things you learn in journalism is that there's never one perspective to a story. A story is not made up of one strand. Stories are made up of many strands. Sometimes they pull against each other, sometimes they work together, but they create the quilt that is our world, that makes the world so incredibly fascinating. And for me, China will always be a place of incredible fascination because of its history, because of how quickly it's changing, because of how the way they have to try and manage all of that, and as well deal with the external pressures. And I remember, there's a lot of people that compete on the international surfing circuit who are from Brazil. And I remember a lot of Brazilians always saying, we really want to go back to our motherland, which is Portugal. This is where we originally came from. And sometimes when they go back to Portugal, they'd be disappointed because Portugal is not Brazil. And so this is also one of the challenges. People have this idea of China, but your idea of China can change depending on where you end up and how that story then becomes part of the new place you live. And for me, being able to go in and out of China and back and forth several times, every time I go there, it's a different place. Every time I go there, I learn something new. But that's just a brief introduction to my China story. And I also hope that by this work that you're doing at the Institute here, Jean, that it really helps to recalibrate the relationship that Australia and China enjoyed for many decades, but as we know, There's a lot of tension in that relationship at the moment, and a lot of misunderstanding, I think. And I hope that relationship can get back on track, because there's so much more that we can gain from a beneficial relationship that is important for both countries, and the alternative is probably not a good thing to contemplate too much. So thank you, and I look forward to chatting further with you.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for such interesting stories. I know you can tell that Tracy is such a good storyteller. And I'm so thrilled to have Tracy because she not only is so busy, being in a high profile in the media, it's really hard to put aside a date that you will make yourself available. And so even yesterday I text, you still good to go tomorrow? So yes, I'm so grateful that she has committed to this and made this happen. And you can see the stories she has told is really interesting. And I have quite a number of interesting questions to ask Tracy. First of all, Tracy, you are one of the long-standing sports anchor on TV and on radio in Australia. Were you always interested in sports and want to be a sports reporter, or did you just happen to find that passion by accident?
Well, I think given my story about standing on the roundabout in Sheko, you can understand a lot in my life just kind of happens. I'm happy to hop into the flow and see where it takes me, and sports journalism has been one of those areas too, because growing up in surfing, I was always around a sort of competitive sporting environment. And the thing that I noticed outside of sport is that not everybody was like an athlete. And athletes are very goal-oriented. They set out to achieve something. If they don't achieve it, they analyse and reanalyse and set their next goal, and they go back and try again. So generally speaking, it's a really positive environment. The other thing about sport is that it can take you on world travels. And this is how my childhood was spent. And I was trying to orchestrate away, okay, so how can I just keep replicating that over and over, but turn it into a career? And so sports reporting as such didn't make it for me, because I actually don't care who wins or loses. I don't care who's injured. I don't care who they're competing against next. What really fascinates me is the psychology of athletes and what sport says about the cultures and the countries of where these athletes come from, and what happens when they come together to compete. And you can learn a lot about a place by watching how their athletes perform and speak and navigate their own way around the world. So when I finished my HSC, my mum phoned me up one day, and it was about 11 o'clock, and it was about 3 weeks after the HSC, and I answered the phone, hello. She said, were you still asleep? I said, yes. She said, okay, well, I'll tell you what, by the time I get home, I want you either to be enrolled in a course, to have a job, or to have moved out. So I've always enjoyed a challenge. I did all three. And I was lucky enough to end up a couple of years later at the ABC with a trainee broadcast position. They offered 2 scholarships each year, and I was lucky enough to get one of those back in 1989.
That follows my second question. You were the first Australian female to host a national sports program, which is the ABC Grandstand. And also you were the founding member and the only female panelist, regular panelist on Fox Sports on their highest rating program called Backpage from 1991 up to almost 10 years, 2001. When I worked at SBS as heading the subtitling department, subtitling is a very literal language program, but we also use very sophisticated technology. So from time to time, I had to sit with technology people for meeting, and they were all blokes. quite intimidating, and I never got the jokes that they cracked. So I was really intrigued to ask you this question. What was it like having your say in Boys Club? And also, what has been changed through having female voices in the male-dominated sports world?
Well, I have to say, I feel very lucky, and maybe my story doesn't match with everybody else's. But when I started at the ABC in the sports department, there were no other female broadcasters. And the program went on a Saturday and Sunday. All week they'd prepare. Saturday started at 10 and finished at 6:30. And Sunday started at 11, I think. It later changed to 12 and went to 6:30. So it was many, many hours to fill. And every single minute was filled with men's sport. But it was these men that gave me a job, and these men that agreed to train me. I don't think they knew what they were doing when they gave that position to me, because the first day I got to work, they said, I said, okay, so what do I do? And they said, oh, well, you can just sit there and read the papers, like read up on every sport. So I was like, okay, but that's pretty boring. So I'm flicking through the papers. But I found a story at the front of the paper, and it said that the rugby league was going to lose its sponsorship. It was sponsored by a cigarette company because the government was changing the law, and there could be no more cigarette companies sponsoring sport. And I thought, well, that's quite a good story. And the spokesperson for the cigarette company was one of the famous Ella brothers. There are 3 Indigenous brothers, the Ella brothers, who played rugby union for Australia, absolutely legendary. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I'm going to ring up this Ella brother and ask him, what's the story? What's going to happen? Where will we get the money from? And how's the sport going to go? So I ran up to the newsroom and I asked somebody, can you show me how to use this tape recording machine with the telephone? And I got him on the phone, I did the interview, I rewound the tape, and I went downstairs and I said to the blokes who were all sitting there with their feet up on the desk, reading the paper, chatting about whatever, I said, oh, here's an interview with one of the Ella brothers about cigarette sponsorship and what rugby league's going to do without all their money. And they all just looked at me like, oh my God, like, how do we wind this girl back a little? Please, relax. So that also showed them that my fascination was not really, to go to a ground and commentate, although I did do some of that. But it was always this other side of sport that really fascinated me. And I started a program called Women in Sport. And I thought, I'm going to do the same thing. I'll just present them with a 15-minute mini program called Women in Sport that they can run somewhere in their, 20 hours on a weekend. They can give 15 minutes to women. And again, they were like completely shocked. And where are we going to play this? It ended up going so well that we didn't need the 15 minutes anymore, because ABC just started doing a lot more, men and women. And that kind of changed the landscape to a degree, and it has changed a lot since. I've never been, I've never felt concerned about being in a room full of men, and maybe that was because I had a mother and father who both competed and were both pretty equal in that sense, and I never really saw that there was any great division between them. I did notice that there was a great division between men and women when we came back to Australia. But, it's changed a lot in a sporting sense, but it's still got a long way to go. But we know that in coverage now, a female voice can bring more of the same qualities, or it can bring a whole other dimension. And it's not just in reporting, but in boards, governing boards or senior management positions in sporting organisations around the country, in government, in top companies that sponsor major events. It makes a huge difference in academia. And, I'm hopeful one day that we get to a point where we don't even have to talk about, men or women. And we know that sometimes in a lot of places, and I think there's still a bit of this in sports media, diversity means white male or white female. And so we're also starting to see that change as well, that diversity doesn't mean white male or white female. It means all kinds of people from everywhere that look really different and have very different experiences, because it's only the coming together of those experiences that gives all of us a much better understanding of each other.
You have really answered my next question about
Sorry,
why you have won this award, from ROC for your strong leadership and mentorship and journalism in women, particularly for women, next generation female journalists. And I have to ask you this question because you're so much strong on the rights. I mean, not necessarily just the female rights, but, female voice is so important because my 19-year-old daughter the other day asked me a question saying that, do you think you are feminist? And she sensed my hesitation. I said, I support women's equality. I'm surprised that you are not a feminist, So I have to ask you this question: do you see yourself as a feminist?
I don't even really know what a feminist is. Like, what is it? I've heard people claiming to be feminists that argue with each other. So, which side do you pick on that argument? And again, it's like anything. I think feminism has changed. And it continues to change, and it means different things. And I don't actually like labels, and I certainly don't like putting labels on myself. I mean, it's human instinct to label people. The minute you walk into a place or see something, you either like it or you don't, or you're making judgments about people when you look at them. You make judgments all the time. And sometimes you can be proven to be completely wrong in your initial judgment. And sometimes you're right. But labels, I think, are there to be broken down because, it's like that thing that I first started with, if it's not moving, it's dead. And so if you can fit neatly into a little box like this that has that label, well, I don't want to be there. Because I would hope that the way I was at 7 is different to the way I was at 27, is I was going to say different to the way I will be at 57, but I pretty much am. So, 67, 87, labels don't sit comfortably with me.
Thank you. You've reported around the world and work on many international networks. As we know, getting out of one's familiar and comfort zone and to get into the world and culture which are completely different from your own is very challenging and sometimes it can be daunting. My question is, how did those overseas experiences, particularly in China, change you and your view of the world?
Oh, phenomenally. And I know that from speaking with my own family members who weren't lucky enough to have those sorts of experiences and to travel very young. And I'll tell you a story. When I first started at the ABC, they said to me, you've got to go on this 2-day course for women in broadcasting. And because it was labelled women in broadcasting, it just got my back up straight away, and I thought, I don't want to be a woman in broadcasting. I just want to be a broadcaster like the rest of you. I'm not interested in going to any of these things. And they said, no, you have to. It's part of okay, whatever. So I went, and the lady that was teaching us at the front said, okay, at the beginning, I want you to take out a piece of paper, and I want you to write on that piece of paper where you see yourself in 6 months, in 2 years, and in 10 years. And I thought, oh my God, I knew this would be a waste of time. I don't know what I'm doing in the next 2 minutes, let alone the next, 6 months, 2 years, whatever. But I did it, I filled it out, and she said, okay, now I want you to fold that up and tuck it into the back of something and maybe pull it out down the track and see how you're going. Well, I put it in the back of my, like a little telephone book, and completely forgot about it for about 15 years. And when I pulled it out, I thought, what's this? I pulled it out and I opened it up and I was, oh my goodness. Like every single thing I had written on there, I had done. And that for me was a real lesson in what's going on in the back of your mind and how you're synthesising information and experiences and having this kind of, if you want to call it a wish list or a vision or a goal or some kind of place you want to go to, it's always there ticking away. And so sometimes when my husband thinks I'm an airhead, and I just kind of think, no, it's just my subconscious at work, it'll happen. And I think that those experiences, one of the things I had written on there was I'd like to have 2 or 3 kids. I'd like to give them the same experience I had, which means living overseas and giving them that, mix of cultures and places. And I was lucky enough that we were able to give them that experience as well. And so when I have conversations with some of my own family members who were not lucky enough to have that, you start conversing from a very different place, and even in a workplace, because there's so much more diversity in a workplace now. I know that when somebody comes in who doesn't look like most of us at the ABC, some people don't know how to have a conversation with those people because they don't know where to start. And so I feel really lucky, like I know exactly where to start, where's the best noodle joint? Those sorts of things, and I think seeing it in my children too. When we come back from Beijing and we'd have holidays in Australia, especially the young one, because he was 6 weeks old when we left for Hong Kong, and when we went to Beijing, we sent him to the local little kindergarten. Nobody spoke English, none of the teachers spoke English, it was just all Chinese, so it was quite difficult to get him in because I had no idea what I was doing, filling out the paperwork, but they took him and he just had the best time, and because he was so young, he was learning more Chinese at school because he was there from 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. than he was learning English at home. And because he was surrounded by Chinese playmates, when we came back to Australia, if we went to the beach or the park or the swimming pool, he'd be looking for the Chinese kids to go and play with because I'm pretty sure he thought he was Chinese. And he'd run up to a group of Chinese kids like, hey! And the Chinese kids would look at him like, what's he doing? It was really interesting just seeing that, but I think that's wonderful.
It is very interesting. And also, you mentioned that you lived in Hong Kong for 2 years. And I'm really interested in knowing what is the lasting impact or memory of living in Hong Kong in your life?
So in Hong Kong, because we were lucky to live in this fishing village, and we would always stop and talk. We lived sort of up on the hill, and you'd come back down around the corner to go into the village. And there was an old Chinese lady who'd lived there for, 80 years. And all of the kids just called her Paw Paw. And we would always stop and chat to Paw Paw. Or when the kids came home on the bus from school, they'd stop and chat to Paw Paw. And so we heard lots of stories about, how this little tiny fishing village, became a sort of a popular summer spot. And a lot of Chinese people would come from the mainland to barbecue on the beach because there were no beaches for them to do that, if they were from Beijing or Shanghai or somewhere. And we just sort of tried to immerse ourselves into that village life. And also in the village was a Tin Hau temple, the goddess of the sea, because it was a fishing village. And so I used to take the kids, and sometimes we'd help clean the Tin Hau temple. Once a year when they'd have the special Tin Hau celebration, I would always make sure the kids would be there from start to finish and hear the chanting, watch the ceremony, seeing the lighting of the incense and getting it all prepared for the next year. And then other silly things, like one of the Chinese neighbours told me one day they came into the house and they saw my kids playing with all this stuff. And the stuff came from the Joss paper store, right? I used to love going to these Joss paper stores to buy these, paper money, pretend cars, pretend handbags, pretend everything, because I wasn't aware that this is the stuff you take to the grave, that you burn for your ancestors for them to celebrate in the afterlife. It's like, oh no, it's just great stuff for them to play with. So it was all that sort of learning, which was terrific. And even right through to a couple of the friends we had. One was this incredible Chinese man who had been a jeweller, but they moved into the village, and I only ever saw him in overalls and bare feet, and he used to walk up and down the beach. He had this incredibly long grey beard, was just beautiful, and this long hair, and his wife was stunning. And so I used to talk to them on the beach every day, and he died of a heart attack unexpectedly, and his wife was understandably in a real mess. And so I helped her organising the funeral. And the whole funeral process was very different to any I had experienced in the past. And so being able to be part of stuff that was really meaningful in a local sense, you know, you can't buy those sorts of experiences. So I forever hold on to those moments as being very special. Yeah.
Now, talking about the working experiences, there are many Australian journalists and international journalists who have been foreign correspondents posted in China, but very few who actually, as you mentioned before, actually worked in China's media system. You know, media is always closed the door. I worked at SBS, so it's to other people it's always a mystery and quite mysterious. And the Chinese media is more mysterious to people, including Chinese. So you worked in CCTV and also China Global Television Networks. Was it hard to transit from Australian networks to CCTV operation and system? What were the challenges?
I think if you went in there expecting it to be like your experiences in Australia, it would be incredibly challenging. But I've always been pretty lucky that when I go into a situation, I try not to have any expectations, because you can only be disappointed, I think, because nothing is going to be the same. And so I went in there trying to have a clean slate, and that this experience was going to be very different to my own experience at home in Australia. And it was. It was very different. One of the biggest differences, and this ties back to something you were asking me earlier, is that one day I arrived at work, and so I worked for a unit called Sports Scene. And it was really great because it was in the build-up to the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games, so there was all of that happening and a lot of change that was happening around that. But everybody who was anyone in the sports world, from IOC presidents to world champions like Ian Thorpe, they were all coming through Beijing. And I thought, that's great, I can access all of these people and put them on CCTV. So there was that, but I rocked up at work one day and the boss, who was the executive producer for the day, was a woman. The program producer was a woman. The editors who were cutting the stories were all women. The camera person was a woman. And I walked in, and it was just an accident of rostering, right? But every single person on the team that day was female. And it just looked so strange because we would never have that here in Australia still. And so I went, oh, wow, this is amazing. We're all women today. And they all looked at me like I was mad. Like, what is your problem? And so that was also a real wake-up call. But of course, the whole storytelling method was quite different. The editing was different. The way people would film was different. And we had an experience one day where one of the top basketballers from the USA had been flown in by one of Beijing's richest men to sort of meet and greet a stadium full of people because they love their basketball in Beijing. Anyway, when this superstar arrived, the guy decided, too bad about the people in the stadium. I just want my 12-year-old son to have a one-on-one session with this guy. So everyone who was in the stadium who was waiting to meet this NBA star naturally got pretty angry, and they started setting fire to things in the stadium. They were ripping up seats. It became a big problem. So the cameraman had been sent there to film the superstar and the interaction. And because there was none, he came back to work and we said, "Oh, fantastic, have you got the vision, like of the seats being ripped up and setting fire to things?" And he said, "No." And we said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because you sent me there to film this NBA superstar and he never arrived." It's like, I know, but this is like a great story anyway. You could have filmed that. And so I realised even simple things like that can be quite different. People talk about things being lost in translation. That's just one small example. And it's not because any system is better or worse, it's just different. And you need to understand those differences in order to get the best out of the moment.
I really appreciate your open-mindedness, and as you can see, that's why you have been surviving everywhere and making all the successes wherever you are. Working in the China's media, what was it like to see China from inside rather than, as you mentioned, Stan would see from outside in?
The one thing about Stan's journalism, and I always wonder when I get invited to things like this, like, why are you talking to me? You should be talking to my husband. Because, he brings a completely different intellectual rigour to all of these experiences. But one of the things about my husband is that wherever he was in the world, whatever story he tries to tell, it is always people-based. Because everyone in this room knows that people confuse our politics and our politicians and our governments with the people. And the people are very different because there's just this, complete array. And it's really unfair to judge a people by a government of the day. So Stan would always tell his stories, which were always, of the great sort of power machinations that are happening in a place, through the people. And he would do his utmost. He was detained several times. He's had run-ins, all of the above. But he would go to extraordinary lengths to get the story from the people. Also knowing full well that those people would suffer ramifications, and so he would always check with them as well. You're fully aware of what will happen if you speak to me, and the story goes to air around the world. And most of these people knew and they were aware. My experience was very different because I was working with these colleagues at CCTV. We would go out and meet Chinese athletes. And that was one of the great experiences for me as well, getting to know some of the Chinese Olympic Committee and the Chinese athletes and their system of sport and how some things were very similar to ours. In fact, we borrowed some of their system at our Institute of Sport and how things were different. And so it enabled me to be able to compare the experiences my husband was having with the stories that I was hearing of the people inside Beijing and their own experiences, and then the way that I was kind of filtering that information from both sides. And my husband and I still compare notes every day on all sorts of things, and there's a lot of stuff we still don't agree with each other on. But it makes for fascinating conversation, at least, having these two experiences that don't align. Sometimes they're like this, but I think both of us have benefited from learning from the other.
Definitely, the world is becoming richer because you see all around. Can you give us an example of what was the most interesting and what was the most frustrating experience working in Chinese media?
The most interesting was just the people and the friendships, which I still have today. Even though that friendship, it's very difficult to know which word to use. And this is the other great thing about learning about other cultures. You know that people think differently, and the way we think in our very sort of linear way is completely different to this kind of circular yin and yang thinking, which is very different. And I just love that, because I love this idea that things continue to evolve, and it's not just like that. So, you know, speaking to my friends now, we can't email in the same way, you know, given that everything that they do is being monitored and watched so carefully. And so one of the first things I learnt in China, somebody said to me, don't listen to what's being said. Listen for what's not being said, because that's actually the message. And so sort of learning to be able to think on multiple levels when you're having those conversations, but still having those friendships is vitally important. And when I went back to Beijing for the Winter Olympics in February, to catch up with some of my old friends, my colleagues, that I hadn't seen for many, many years, was incredible. And it was also quite sad too, because as I was flying into Beijing, I was like, my heart started beating faster, and I was thinking of all of those great things. Like, I love just walking through the back streets, and I love just sort of discovering something, or a little van that is selling street food, or meeting somebody and having a chat. And then I realised, because of the severe COVID lockdown restrictions, I wasn't going to be able to do that, and I got incredibly sad. And I also realised that unless my friends, the few that had been selected to be inside that Olympic bubble as well, that I was going to get to be able to talk to, most of them were still outside that bubble, and I wasn't going to be able to share a meal or a laugh or stories about what had changed in our own lives in the years since. So, you know, that's the most lasting thing, is definitely the friendships, and I hope to be back there at some point where there isn't this lockdown, and we can have that relationship again. The frustrations, you know, every workplace has frustrations. I have them here. It's not unique to being in a foreign country, but of course in a foreign country they're different because they do things differently, and sometimes it takes a while to hop into that system and to learn. You know, there are some things I could tell you maybe if that tape wasn't on, but because this is going to live forever, I won't go there. Maybe if we have a one-on-one chat later. There's lots of very funny stories, you know, but it wouldn't be fair to sort of to share those in any way that's going to, you know, bring criticism or you know, any kind of negative perspective.
To make up for the parts that you missed the most in Beijing, we would like to play this little clip that we found on the internet, and I love it to pieces. Can you show it?
It's about 4:15, and I normally head off about now to go and have my late lunch, early dinner break. And just by the train station over here, there's a lady that sells cold noodles. It's 5 kwai, which is, you know, less than $1, and they're really beautiful. There's always a crowd. I think people are always interested when they see a foreigner eating street food, but I don't know why, because it's really good. I think that's part of the fun of eating in places like this, and being involved in a culture that is so different to your own, and to not be afraid of that, you know, to really give it a go and just experience it, because they're the sorts of memories that you take home with you. When I first came here, I thought, wow, it's so big, it's so dynamic, it's going to take me forever to learn everything about this city. I haven't learned everything about the city, but I was surprised at how easy it was to get to know.
Well, having heard Tracy's story, sort of all this relates so well, and then you can see why. And she really embraces everything that she was in there.
I've got to tell you a little story. So one of the clips that they did for this documentary, they were doing a series of people, foreigners that lived in China and their experiences, sort of like the conversations you're having here at the Institute. And we used to go across the road where we lived. There was this massive park, and there were about, I don't know, 20 or 30 table tennis tables, they were always full, especially with the older Chinese, you know, in their 70s, into their 80s. They'd always be playing table tennis. So I'd always take the boys across, and you know, so sometimes, or this one particular time, this old lady said to one of my boys, "Okay, you, come and play." So he's down the end, so, "Okay, you serve." So, and she goes, "Smash!" Anyway, so then she serves and it goes straight past him. He's like, oh. Anyway, after about 3 balls, she said to him, "You're terrible, you go, you go." So these old Chinese people wouldn't play my kids because I was so bad. But it was, I mean, that was wonderful. You know, they always talk about that. It's just incredible.
It is. Now we have to ask, I mean, time's so short, there's so many interesting stories. I have to ask this question. I really enjoyed Tracy's reaction, but let's see how she reacted. So when in 2018 you discovered that your great-great-grandfather was a Chinese doctor called Joseph Ling, and we have actually a friend, your brother is called Joseph Ling, who came from Fujian, yes, also from Fujian to Australia in the 1850s. What was your reaction when you first heard the discovery, and how did you tell your husband Stan?
Well, I was sitting in bed one morning, and I need to give a bit of background to this because Stan and I, you know, we lived in Hong Kong, gave the kids that experience, went to Beijing, went to the Middle East, went back to Beijing, and I said to Stan one day when we were hopping off on the plane, and it was quite early on in our first stint living in Beijing, you'd hop off the plane and I'd look out the window, especially if we were flying in at winter. The landscape is just so hard, you know, these trees, there's just like branches, you think they're all dead, but then spring comes and they all just burst into flower. And I said to Stan, and it was quite polluted at that time, the pollution in Beijing is nothing like it used to be when we were first there, which is one of the major shifts, which is fantastic. But I said to Stan, we hopped off the plane and walked out, and I could smell that kind of, sometimes it was almost like a bushfire smell, you know, but it was sulphur smell, it was pollution, and it shouldn't be a pleasant smell. But I said to Stan, I don't know what it is, Stan, but every time we come back to Beijing, I just feel so at home. And he thought I was insane. I was like, you really are weird. Anyway, at the time that we were living there, my cousin, who was from the same side of the family, had moved to Shanghai, and he had a couple of kids there, and he gave his daughter a Chinese name, you know, and he just loved Shanghai, and we'd always be arguing, no, Beijing's better, no, Shanghai's better, you know, that typical kind of, almost like a Sydney-Melbourne thing. And I had another cousin from the same side of the family who'd married a Chinese doctor and was living in Singapore. And they have 6 kids. And at one point, her kids were DNA tested, and she was always intrigued because she's quite freckly with red hair. And she's like, my kids look 100% Chinese. Something is going on. She said, I know they came out of my stomach, but they have nothing that looks like me. Anyway, so after doing this DNA testing, they saw, oh right, the doctor said, well, they're more than 50% Chinese, you know that? And she was like, what? She went back and started doing some work, you know, through the army records and through the archives, and it was her that sent me this message from Singapore. She said, guess what? Have a look at this. And here was, you know, some photos of different things, a birth certificate, some other things, this full-on story. And so as I'm reading it, it really made me laugh. And I thought, oh my God, no wonder I felt so at home in Beijing. And so I said, Stan, look at this. So I passed it on, and Stan went, oh yeah, I thought so.
I remember I watched a couple of years ago, or quite recently, 2021, the two of us, yeah. And you told us, Stan, just said, guess what? And I'm actually Chinese. And then people start asking you, say, wow, you know, how did you feel like you are Chinese? And if you said, I feel the same.
That was one of the extraordinary things,
Yes.
because I was walking through the ABC lobby and the producer of that show was sitting with Stan, and she said, "Oh, we're doing this thing, you know, I've got a secret." I think it was called something like that.
Yes.
"So we'd really like to talk to you, Stan." And Stan said, "Oh, no, everyone knows my secrets. You need to talk to Tracy. Boy, has she got a secret." Anyway, so as I walked by, she said, "Have you got a secret?" I went, "No." And she said, "Oh, well, Stan just told me." I said, "Oh, you mean about being Chinese?" And she went, "Yeah, I mean," and she was looking around, "How did that make you feel?" And I started laughing. I said, "Well, like, great, you know, fantastic. I know more about my family now than I did before, but I'm still the same." And she said, "Did it make you challenge any ideas you had about yourself?" It's like, no. It just makes our story richer, you know, and what I want to know is more. I want to know more, not less. I'm not frightened by this, you know. It's really odd, and still people come up to me. So sometimes in the street, people come up, "Oh, hi, I saw that story you did about you being Tony Blanco." I was like, "Yeah, it's okay. I can talk about it freely."
I really appreciate that, because deep down it's not just, you know, I am who I am. I just feel like the color of a skin or whatever appear doesn't really change who I am. And I think that this is really fundamental for everyone, especially in Australia, to accept, you know, we should not be judged by the color of our skin, by how we look, ethnicity. So it's really cool. You can see that her reaction. I have to ask her this kind of intellectual question, because I'm really intrigued, and as I said, and I quite enjoy listening to your program, because your international experiences and connections have clearly provided you with the global perspective, particularly the ticket. If anyone hasn't listened to the ticket, I highly recommend it. Because the world is becoming more and more diverse, and inclusion is becoming more pressing, but also more complex. Issues such as lately the World Swimming Governance Body, FINA, banned transgender women from competing in women's events. You talked about this in your the ticket program. And these issues are actually quite intriguing and divisive. So striking a balance and maintaining the needed consistency in rules and regulations are really getting harder to achieve. What is your approach in formulating a progressive discussion on complex and divisive issues like this?
Well, you're probably asking the wrong person, because David Rowe is sitting in the room. And, you know, he's studied some of these complex issues around sport and media and how it's reported over many, many years. He's the expert, so chat to him later. Look, every week I start afresh and I go, okay, what am I going to do on the show this week? And I have all these plans, and by Friday all those plans are out the door because something else has happened, and then I'm madly scrambling trying to fill an hour with this new problem that has come along, and generally it's a problem. Only because I think I try to present scenarios, speak to as many voices as possible that can bring a different perspective and maybe help people think differently about an issue that they've only ever seen in one context. And so by bringing in other voices and other thinking, sometimes they're not even related to sport, but it helps broaden a discussion so that people can see maybe there is a way through this. And I always try and make it so that at the end of the week, if someone has listened to this and they have faced this issue, they're charged with new ammunition to be able to find a solution, or at least some way to progress the issue, or to try and make it better, or to try and govern sport better, or to try and understand their opponents better, whatever the situation may be. But I try and make it, there's no answer to some of these problems. This week we're seeing one in rugby league, and you know, the Manly rugby league team decided they would hand out to the players this jersey with a pride stripe, which has become synonymous with LGBTQIA+. But 50% of the team are Pacifica, people with a very religious culture around them who would feel very uncomfortable wearing that. So they said, we'd rather not. Can we just wear the normal jumpers? No, you have to wear this jumper. Well, we can't. So we'll sit out that. And now that story is just being framed as you're homophobes. And these guys are being slammed, and they're not homophobes. In fact, they've never had a discussion about LGBTQI at the club. So even that, it's a problem that didn't need to happen, actually, because if the management of the club had sat down with its players and said, we want to do something, it's not even Pride Round, it's Women's Round. So management kind of got quite a few things wrong before this problem ever existed. If they sat down with the players and said, we're celebrating Women's Round, let's all get involved in designing how we're going to do that, this problem would not even be there. So it's this constant kind of reminder that we have to talk to each other, otherwise these problems are going to continue to keep happening and then getting blown out of proportion with both sides or all sides suffering. You have to be at the table, and it comes back to someone said earlier, you have to listen, and you have to hear. And sometimes, especially with social media now, all you get is yelling. You get yelling from that extreme against the yelling at that extreme, and actually the people who can make the difference are right here in the middle, and we need to find the bits where these circles kind of overlap. That's where you start working at solving the problems that grow outwards.
So you can see that Tracy's approach to sports reporting is far more than just the sports. It's really touching all the human issues and quite intriguing. Before I ask my last short question, I would like to give our audience a chance to ask Tracy a question. Okay, you go. Yeah, two of you, so one and two, yeah.
Is the link at the back?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Tracy, for sharing your international experience. We do appreciate that a lot. Okay, my question is, in recent years, we have seen the deteriorating relationship between China and Australia, and especially our major partner America always see China's rise as a threat toward the so-called rule-based order. And then I know here media play an important role to how we see each other, especially how we see each other. So what is your view toward what Australia we should do to position our position in the region as one question? The second
one is enough. So we only allow one because of the reason next one.
What do you think the role for the media can play in this?
I think the media plays such a crucial role, probably more crucial than it deserves. But for people who don't know anything about China, if your only information is coming from the media, then the media has a huge responsibility to get that story right. And again, it's impossible to tell a whole story in a 2.5-minute news package. But that's why I think it's important. There must be diversity of experience, of voice, of understanding working in the media, because if we're just getting the same voice and the voices are always the same people coming out of Canberra, we're getting a very skewed perspective, which is very unfair. And it's one of the things that, we're always hypercritical of how we are reported in other places, or the way the media tells its stories in China. But we need to be very careful that if we're not going to fall into the same trap where it's just propaganda, really, and it's just a political view of the day, there's no point to that. The media really does genuinely have a responsibility to inform and educate, and sometimes the media is not up to that task, unfortunately.
Very good answer. Last question, do you?
Yes.
Okay, please.
I think my voice is
Short one.
I have a very low-key question, so they may be a little bit personal, but would like to have your feedback on that. So after you find out that somehow in a few generations before you have the Chinese blood, how do you deliver that message to your children, and how they react upon that news?
They reacted the same as me, like, oh, that's cool. Because I think for the same reason that, like, China's not something foreign to them, you know, because they'd had the experience of living there and Chinese friends and Chinese school and doing whatever the Chinese kids are doing on the weekend. So it was no great surprise. And I think also, you know, being my husband's side of the family has a mix of all sorts of things in him as well, but predominantly Indigenous Australian, First Nations. So, you know, having a mix, it was sort of nothing. It was great to know, and it's intriguing, and we'd like to know more, and I'd love to go back to Fujian and find...
Have you been there?
Not yet.
Wow. Josephine can help.
We can go together. Yeah. And so just to sort of identify so people can understand what happened, my father's name is Holmes, which is my name, but I remember him telling me, yeah, we call ourselves Holmes, but we're not really Holmes. It's like, well, what are you? He said, I don't know. And so then there was some discussion about maybe it's Bates, maybe it's Collis. Like, they had no idea what their name was. Weird people, my father's side of the family, right? So anyway, as it turned out, my grandmother's grandfather was the guy, Joseph Lin, that came from Fujian. And he was a Chinese doctor that embedded himself in a town where we now have a property. Stan and I bought a property there. It was where a lot of the gold digging activity was happening. And we were really happy to know that the very first landholder of this property we've now bought was a Chinese man, but it wasn't Joseph Lin. But Joseph hooked up with an Australian lady who'd been married before to a man named Holmes, and he had died, and she had children to him. So when she hooked up with Joseph Lin, she had 3 more children, and the kids were being teased at school. So they just changed their name from Lin to Holmes. So I'm now called Tracy Holmes, which is a name that is not actually anything to do with me or my side of the family.
We have to stop here because you can see that the reason why we are so lucky to have a Tracy here is just a fantastic storyteller, and all her experiences and mindset, and then way she approaches the world, the way she approaches her work, and the human nature is just so fantastic. Please give her a round of a big applause. Thank you. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks.